Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm Sarah, and today I'd like to talk to you about something that I believe is at the heart of doing business, and that is negotiating agreements. One of the core needs of all businesses is creating agreements, whether setting up trade contracts, negotiating employee benefits, or making the decisions needed for the day-to-day operations of a business. All of these processes begin with a negotiation between parties. The book Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In by Roger Fisher and William Ury explores the mistakes people often make during negotiations and proposes a method for how to better negotiate in order to reach optimal outcomes. They also address what to do when negotiating with unwilling or hostile parties or when there is an unequal balance of power between parties. The book was initially published in 1981 in the U.S. by Houghton Mifflin Company and later updated and published by Penguin Books in 1991. The second edition, which I'm reviewing today, also includes the addition of Bruce Patton as editor. In the book, the authors lay out the essential mistake most people make in trying to negotiate agreement. The main problem is that people tend to bargain over positions. They write, quote, "Each side takes a position, argues for it, and makes concessions to reach a compromise. The problem with this," they write, "is that, quote, as more attention is paid to positions, less attention is devoted to meeting the underlying concerns of the parties. Agreements become less likely. Any agreement reached may reflect a mechanical splitting of the difference between final positions rather than a solution carefully crafted to meet the legitimate interests of the parties. The result is frequently an agreement less satisfactory to each side than it could have been." They write that there are 5 main flaws to bargaining over positions. 1, it produces unwise agreements. 2, it is inefficient. 3, it endangers an ongoing relationship. 4, it is even worse when there are many parties involved. And finally, they write, quote, "Being nice is no answer," which means that people often feel they have to choose between either hard bargaining or soft bargaining, more often choosing soft bargaining, and this often comes to the detriment of their own needs and boundaries. They write that there are 3 main criteria by which to judge a negotiation method. 1, it should produce a wise agreement. 2, it should be efficient. And 3, it should improve or at least not damage the ongoing relationship between the parties. To address this issue, they say it's important to understand 2 basic concepts. 1, the game of negotiation takes place at 2 levels. The first level is the substance of the issue. The second level is the procedure to address the substance. The second concept is to identify the 4 main parts of the negotiation and reframe your perception and approach to them. This is how they introduce the 4 parts of the basic method: the people, the interests, the options, and the criteria. For the people, they write, quote, "Separate the people from the problem." For interests, quote, "Focus on interests, not positions." For options, quote, "Generate a variety of possibilities." And for criteria, they write, quote, "Insist that the result be based on some objective standard." In the first part of presenting their method, they talk about the people problem. They say that we must remember negotiators are people. And that means, humans are sensitive, complex beings who experience an enormous spectrum of emotions, moods, egos, values, backgrounds, and fallibility. They say that throughout negotiation, always ask yourself, am I paying attention to the people problem? And to do that, focus on substance and relationship, and more specifically, separate relationship from substance. They say to take a moment to examine issues from the other party's point of view, not to put the blame on them. For example, don't say, "Oh, you and your company are unreliable." Say to them, certain deadlines are not being met in the course of the day-to-day operations of the company, and then ask them what suggestions they have for addressing that issue. They also say to give them a stake in the outcome. They say recognize and understand emotions. For example, get to the root of the cause of emotions that you or the other parties may be experiencing. Acknowledge emotions as legitimate, and also don't react to emotional outbursts that may happen during negotiations. They also say to give space for yourself or the other party to express emotions. They also talk about communication, and they say it's important to use effective communication skills like engage in active listening, speak to be understood, and have a purpose behind what you say. They also write that you should engage in preventative measures by continuing to build a working relationship. By facing the problem and not the people, which means don't make it personal. Keep it about the issue. The second part of the method is to focus on interests, not positions. They say the interests are what define the problem, and that reconciling interests rather than positions work because, quote, for every interest, there usually exists several possible positions that could satisfy it. All too often, people simply adopt the most obvious position. And they also go on to write, what, quote, when you do look behind opposed positions for the motivating interests, you can often find an alternative position which meets not only your interests, but theirs as well. They also say that, quote, behind opposed positions lie shared and compatible interests, as well as conflicting ones. They write, quote, a close examination of the underlying interests will reveal the existence of many more interests that are shared or compatible than ones that are opposed. To identify interests, apply the basic question of why to a situation. They say examine each position asking this question, and then ask why not. Think about the other party's choice. They write that, quote, what interests of theirs stand in the way? If you are trying to change their minds, the starting point is to figure out where their minds are now. In discussing interests, they say to be specific about your interests, to acknowledge the other party's interests, and affirm from them that you understand them correctly. They write to be forward-looking. They say that, quote, you will satisfy your interests better if you talk about where you would like to go rather than about where you have come from. They also write to be concrete but flexible, which means clearly assert your needs and boundaries, but be open to new ideas. They say to, quote, be hard on the problem, but soft on the people. And they also say, don't commit to your position, but do be committed to your interests. The third part of the method is to invent options for mutual gain. To do this, you must first address what they say are the four major obstacles that inhibit people's ability to do so. 1, they make premature judgments. 2, they search for a singular answer. 3, they assume there is only a small number of solutions, often looking at an issue as either or. And 4, they see solving the problem as exclusively their problem. To address these mistakes, separate the process of thinking of different solutions from the process of deciding which solution to use. Also, they write, broaden your options. To do this, they develop something called the circle chart. So this is used to identify 1, what is wrong, and 2, what might be done. There are 4 parts to the circle chart. It's a circle divided in 4 pieces. The top half of the circle addresses the problem with theory. The bottom half addresses the problem in the real world. So step 1 begins in the bottom half, the real world, and that is identify the problem. Step 2 is in the top half, theory, and that is analyze the problem, make observations, and explore causes and symptoms. Step 3, which is also in the top half, says identify different approaches and strategies that can be taken. Step 4 is back where we began in the bottom half, real world, and that is identify real world actions that can be taken. In going through this process, they write, keep certain things in mind. You should examine the problem through the perspective of relative experts or professionals. Invent agreements of different strengths, different levels of strength. Adjust the scope of a proposed agreement if need be. And look for areas of mutual gain and identify shared interests. They also say you should identify areas of differences that might have mutual complements. And also identify the other party's preferences and make their decision easy. And what they mean by this, they write, quote, rather than make things difficult for the other side, you want to confront them with a choice that is painless as possible. Lastly, they say, quote, making threats is not enough. Obviously, do not use ultimatums or force in order to reach an agreement. The fourth part of the method is insist on using objective criteria. They say you should engage in principled negotiation. To do this, certain standards must be met. First, use fair standards. Agreements should be based on objective measurements, like, for example, market value, or what a court would say, what precedent may exist, scientific judgment, equal treatment, tradition, reciprocity, professional standards, etc. They also say use fair procedures. For example, they write, quote, as you consider procedural solutions, look at other basic means of settling differences, taking turns, drawing lots, letting someone else decide, and so on. Next, negotiate using the objective criteria you have identified. In doing this, they advise to remember 3 main points. 1, frame each issue as a joint search for objective criteria. 2, reason and be open to reason as to which standards are most appropriate and how they should be applied. And 3, never yield to pressure, only to principle. After talking about the mistakes commonly made in negotiations and the method to use to address them, the authors acknowledge that not all parties will always be open to this method of negotiation. There are 3 main types of difficult parties that they identify are those with power, those who, quote, won't play, and those who use, quote, dirty tricks. When dealing with those with more power, they write, quote, in response to power, in response to power, the most any method of negotiation can do is to meet 2 objectives. First, to protect you against making an agreement you should reject, and second, to help you make the most of the assets you do have so that any agreement you reach will satisfy your interests as well as possible. So to protect yourself, you may want to, for example, establish a bottom line. This can be helpful in certain situations, but they also caution that there are pitfalls to doing this, like limiting the creative process and seeing possible options. Instead, they suggest you know what they call your BATNA, B-A-T-N-A, and this is an acronym for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. They write that, quote, your BATNA not only is a better measure, but also has the advantage of being flexible enough to permit the exploration of imaginative solutions. Instead of ruling out any solution which does not meet your bottom line, you can compare a proposal with your BATNA to see where it better satisfies your interests. They say you should also actively continue to examine, develop, and update your BATNA. They also say to make the most of your assets and look for your own areas of strength when assessing your BATNA. they say you should also consider the other side's BATNA. They say this will help you think about alternatives and options that may be attractive to the other side. They write, quote, that the more you can learn of their alternatives, the better prepared you are for negotiation. Knowing their alternatives, you can realistically estimate what you can expect from negotiation. If they appear to overestimate their BATNA, you will want to lower their expectations. The second type of difficult party they discuss are those who won't play, meaning they may be stubbornly attached to their specific positions, or they may attack your positions or proposals. To deal with these types, it's important to focus their attention on the merits. The first approach for doing this is to focus on what you can do. You can still focus on merits rather than positions, even if they won't. You can still use interests, options, and criteria in your negotiation. If this doesn't work, then focus on what the other party may do, and this can help redirect their attention to the merits. The third approach is to focus on what a third party can do. Consider bringing in a third party that's trained to mediate and keep the negotiations focused on interests, options, and criteria. The last difficult group they address are those who use dirty tricks. They explain these types as such. They range from, quote, lies and psychological abuse to various forms of pressure tactics. They may be illegal, unethical, or simply unpleasant. Their purpose is to help the user win some substantive gain in an unprincipled contest of will. Such tactics may be called tricky bargaining. The authors write that there are two ways most people respond to this. One, they put up with it, or they give up, which is the most common response. Or two, they respond in kind, and neither of these are good options. Instead, the authors suggest that you must confront them directly. They write there are 3 steps in negotiating the rules of the negotiating game, where the other side seems to be using a tricky tactic. Recognize the tactic, raise the issue explicitly, and question the tactic's legitimacy and desirability. Negotiate over it. Doing this sets the stage for you to negotiate about the rules of the game. From there, the main method that they established in the previous chapters for effective negotiations may now be initiated and engaged in. They add that in dealing with these types to remember, quote, don't be a victim. They write, quote, whatever you do, be prepared to fight dirty bargaining tactics. You can be just as firm as they can, even firmer, and it is easier to defend principle than an illegitimate tactic. Don't be a victim. They conclude the book by addressing the top 10 questions people ask about getting to yes. There they have added some useful updates and a way to provide some interaction and clarification to their readers. I think that this book offers great advice and brings to light useful ways to change one's perspective in negotiating agreement. It's written in clear and concise language, and it offers many real-life examples of how to apply these methods. They include, for example, familiar types of conversations we've all heard or been through, and then they translate them into language that would be more effective and that utilizes their suggested methods. The only weakness to the book is in the section on the 3 types of difficult parties to negotiate with. While they are very useful, they still somewhat only present a partial solution, and they don't make clear enough when and how you should decide if you need to just walk away. The essential issue is that it's unrealistic to expect that you will always be able to find a way to negotiate fair agreements with certain types of people. However, overall, I found the book very insightful and useful in improving my own communication style and in my day-to-day life. Thank you for joining me and listening to my report. I wish you victory and justice in all your future negotiations. Thank you.